Hi, Human Development students. We are now starting our third unit in the course. We're going to be talking about adults from midlife to old age. And today's class is going to be about physical changes that happen mostly in midlife, which I'll define in just a second. But welcome to the third unit. If we were in class in a normal situation, I would start this lecture by talking about what middle age means to you. And I am going to give a formal definition of this in just a second. But not just what it means to you, but what are some of the behaviors that you either stereotypically or based on your own experiences, you think about when you think about somebody who's middle aged. And then I'd bring up this article. So this article comes from Huffington Post, so obviously not a scientific article. And also it is British. I don't know who the author was, but you'll see why in just a second. But I just think it's kind of interesting to think about how we see middle-aged adults. If I remember correctly, this article was actually written by somebody who was from within that population. But nevertheless, let's just go through a few of them. So signs you are middle-aged. So losing touch with everyday technology. Finding you have no idea what young people are talking about. Feeling stiff in the morning, needing an afternoon nap, and groaning when you bend down. So already you start to see some of these physical concepts, but also these generational differences that have emerged between people who are middle-aged and people who are younger. On average, obviously not every single person within a given age cohort is going to be the same. There are a lot of individual differences. We see number 9, getting more hairy. Maybe we'll talk about that in today's class on physical changes. Changing clothes and shoes for comfort rather than style. I imagine that some of you have parents and or young grandparents who are still very fashionable, but maybe that there is a trend here that comfort comes first. 17, forgetting people's names. We're going to talk about cognitive changes in the next lecture. 20, complaining about the rubbish on TV these days. Obviously, rubbish again being a British term, but the idea here is this really reflective of this population or is this more of a stereotype? I'm going to go to the next slide because there are more. All right, continued. 23, taking a keen interest in the Antiques Roadshow, which is a TV show on PBS if you're not familiar with it. 24, when you start complaining about more things, is that something that is changing with age, or is that something that's an individual difference at any age? So, for example, somebody who is a person who's high in complaining at 20, are they more likely to be the same kind of person at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60? 28, we can think about this in today's day and age, but maybe it's never been different. Being told off for politically incorrect opinions. 30, we will talk about this today, when you can't lose 6 pounds in 2 days anymore. So, holding on to body weight in a different way. Talk about that with physical changes. Let's see. 38, falling asleep after one glass of wine. Or 39, spending more money on face cream or anti-aging products than ever before. So again, this article, I bring this up, it's from Huffington Post, but I bring this up because we've already been talking about adolescents and emerging adults and how we have these ideas of people that fall within that age range. And some of these ideas are stereotypical. Some of these some of these ideas aren't based in research or empirical findings, and it's just kind of these attitudes that we hold about a certain segment of the population. So with the classes that remain in this class, we're going to talk about the people who fall in the range of midlife to old age to see what does the research actually say. Are these ideas, this list of 40 things, common and shown to be things that are happening during this time period, or is this just a stereotype? The whole purpose of this class really is to give you more background on what psychological science says about human development. So hopefully today's class and the classes that remain will give you more insight into this period from midlife to old age. There isn't one definition for what counts as midlife, but let's just give an operational definition for the purposes of this class. We're going to say roughly 40 to 65. We've already talked about midlife a little bit when we talked about adolescence and having parents that might be going through midlife changes as they're going through adolescence. We've already talked about some of these ideas and how when parents are going through midlife, their own crises, and I'm not sure I necessarily want to use that strong of a word, but are overlapping with adolescence. And we talked about things like, adolescents developing a future orientation, whereas adults in midlife might be thinking about a shrinking future, less options, narrowing choices to make. But this is also a time where kids are leaving home, and this is in some ways good, in some ways bad, depending on the relationship and where people stand financially. Career paths tend to be more solidified, but perhaps that is more for those who are stable economically and not for all. Because of all of these social situations or social factors, and also many other different factors, there's wide variation in attitudes and behaviors during this time period. And this should come as no surprise to you. Some of you will know, let's say, a 50-year-old who is in like almost peak physical shape. This 50-year-old is running marathons and eating really healthy and just is just a specimen of good health. And perhaps other things going in that person's life in terms of their medical concerns are good too, like overall good blood pressure and no history of cancer or diabetes or any of those very common illnesses. And then some of you could think of a person who's 50 who is almost opposite, a person who has a lot of aches and pains, whether that's something they can control or they can't control. Again, if it's from a physical illness or if it's from inactivity. So just think about those wide array of behaviors and how is that going to affect one's attitudes? I think about just I have two examples to share. One, I remember in my mid 20s running in an 8K race. And when I was running in this race, there was some point at the end of the race where this woman who had gray hair, I imagine she would have been in her early 60s, just zoomed past me at the end of the race. I was getting tired, my body was getting sore, again in my mid 20s, but she just zoomed by me. And in that moment, instead of feeling bad for myself, I had this moment of like, you go girl, like you go and do it. That's amazing that your body is carrying you in this way. Not that she didn't work for it, I'm sure. I also think about I have my dad and stepmom are people who are healthy eaters and they live in Arizona, so they try to go hiking quite often. They do mountain biking, and so they're very physically active. And I compare that to other people that are in that same age range, and my dad is in his early 60s who are kind of I'm gonna sit at home and on the couch and watch TV and perhaps play cards. So it's not totally I am isolating myself, but it's just differences in ability and desires and activities of what they're doing. So based on all of that, there are some people who are 65, let's say, and they feel really active and young. They might feel like, wow, look at all the things that I can do. And perhaps those lead to good feelings and good attitudes. And there are some who feel old even at 40, and like life is all downhill from there. Our attitudes aren't only based on our behaviors, that's complicated, right? This is psychology. But there is just a wide variation in how individuals in this time period are thinking about their lives. When we think about midlife broadly, this really is more of a new period in the lifespan, and or maybe not entirely new, but the length of time is a newer phenomena because life expectancy is much longer than it ever has been before, and we'll talk about that in a future lecture. Before the 20th century, there was a very short time between, having children and and having the end of your life essentially. People were dying when they're in their 40s and 50s. So that wasn't midlife, that was end of life. People were widows by mid 50s. And whereas now there are people who are having their, first marriages in their 50s or second marriages in their 50s. People were dying because or struggling because their bodies were used to living lives in harsh conditions. And not to say that some people today don't live lives in harsh conditions, but we do know that there are more regulations now for different businesses and trades. So in that sense, this is a part of the lifespan that has become elongated, much like adolescence has become elongated, much like this period of emerging adulthood has emerged. And so now we're looking at this time period as not a sign of old age, but just something, again, maybe between early adulthood and old age. So most of the time we don't talk about it as its own part of the lifespan. It is just part of adulthood, but we definitely could segment it off to be midlife.